You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by
Ron Milam from Fehr and Piers.
Hey, Ron. How are you doing?
I'm doing exceptional today.
Well, welcome back to the network. The last time we chatted was, I think, exactly 5 years ago. So I looked it up, and it was like January 18th or something along those lines of 2018 when we released the last show, episode 168, where we were talking about TRB and CES, which was really, really interesting. We're going to talk a little bit about TRB today. But between now and then, a bit of crazy times. How have you been over the last 5 years?
Still doing well. Still a transportation enthusiast. Excited to talk about things like TRB and CES. But I would have hoped, by getting to this point, 5 years later, we'd have a lot of new content, new ideas, new research, and I think one of the themes I'm coming away from TRB and a lot of recent work is, no, things are very similar to the way they used to be. They haven't really changed that much. And so I'm hoping we get into some of those topics in terms of, how that is going to affect our future, thinking about the transportation systems that we all use and rely on.
Yeah, well, so what have you been working on lately? So if stuff's cyclical, you must be doing some, but you're doing some new stuff and interesting things with, I'm sure, cities and transportation agencies around the country.
Yeah, with my focus here at Fehr and Piers, and I got the fun title of Director of Evolving the Status Quo. So most of the stuff I actually work on is pretty new stuff. And I shared with you the other day the new VMT Plus tool we created here for California to map basically VMT data across the state so people can actually compare and find their own VMT per capita type metrics if they need them for grant applications or impact analysis. So VMT is still a new metric to lots of parts of the country. Here in California, it's been around a little longer. But to the extent that we're still trying to create data, products, estimates, forecasts on the subject, that still feels new, depending on where you're at, maybe in the country. And then back in 2018, when we talked, we were talking about things like autonomous vehicles and more of the technology. The technology discussion is still here, but now with the electrification of the network, electric vehicles, it seems like we're at a kind of a tipping point with whether or not our cities are still going to be designed for cars and movement of the vehicles versus the movement of the pedestrians, the bicyclists, the scooters. So I'm paying more attention to that. Electrification takes away some of the guilt of driving, some of the environmental impacts, but those vehicles still take up a lot of space and affect the urban footprint. So I see the U.S. cities still kind of struggling with that. And that was an issue we're still struggling with 5, 10, 15 years ago. But now there seems to be a little bit more momentum on the vehicle side that we didn't have if you think about neo-traditional planning and smart growth and some of those things.
And the VMT tool, going back to that a little bit, it's in you did it for California. Is it going to come to other parts of the country at some point?
We'd hope so, given the value of that metric for lots of different reasons. Whether you're looking at air quality or greenhouse gases or just things like walk score. It's a way to validate whether or not high walk score places also generate low VMT. Not all of them do, and so you can kind of inspect that and figure out what's going on. But what we did was, this was intended to be a proof of concept. California has wanted a map like this for a long time, given SB 743 and the change to VMT as the environmental impact metric. So Caltrans, Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Air Resources Board have all had interest in this, and they've all attempted to assemble data in some way, shape, or form to produce maps like this. The OPR site check, for those of you using that site, has a little bit of that information. But it's difficult. It's difficult to acquire the data. It's difficult to analyze and assemble the data in the right format that you can put into a map that people can query and filter. And so I can understand why those state agencies didn't quite get that up and running yet. We happen to have a really good working relationship with Streetlight Data, where they listen to our wish list of R&D questions and then help us and partner with us to assemble those when they make sense in the marketplace. And California is a big enough market where I think it made sense for us to acquire the data and work with Streetlight to pull it together in the fashion that we did. Whether or not that makes sense for other states kind of depends on where they end up in the planning and the regulatory world. Are they going to use VMT as a metric for land use projects and transportation projects, such that you need a data set that's consistent and robust, and that you can kind of track over time? I think that's the other thing that we're trying to do with this data set, because the data we released was 2019, and obviously we've got 2022 data coming here shortly, but that's something that we'll be using for our consulting services versus what we did at the tool is we gave that 2019 data out there for public use.
And CARB just said, the VMT reduction is really important, but nobody seems to be taking action on, implementing that. They said, oh, yes, it is important. We need to reduce VMT. We can't just grow vehicle miles traveled and expect that the emissions will come down. And so, who's going to be responsible for that? I imagine that some cities will be using your tool maybe to figure that out.
Yeah, a lot of the bigger cities, urban places have travel demand models that provide the estimates of VMT, and they use in their regular analysis for things like climate action plans or even 743 analysis. But there's a lot of parts of the state, rural counties that don't, or there's typical land uses that we might see as common, like there's a lot of age qualified housing, for example, up and down the state. But a lot of our models don't do a good job of picking up on the nuances of that type of housing product. So this data set actually complements some of the models to help you differentiate. So to the extent that there's a variety of uses here, including the ability to compare. I think one of the things we heard from some agencies, they wanted to be able to compare to the city next door, and that wasn't always easy. So trying to create a product that's flexible and can answer more than just a kind of a 743 question.
Well, so I also, I wanted to talk with you about TRB, and, in 2020, I went and recorded a lot of small vignettes with poster presenters, and that's always fun to go and chat with folks who are presenting their research. But sadly, I didn't get to go this year. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say about what TRB was about this year, how it was like in this world of masks and COVID, and just like your overall impressions. But then maybe you've got some details to share about what was talked about. I saw kind of some of the big picture stuff from Jennifer Homendy and some other folks, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I was really looking forward to TRB this year. I'd gone most years since about 1999, right up until I did 2020, and then 2021, 2022 basically skipped for pandemic reasons. So I was hopeful that there would be a lot of new content, new ideas, research that us practitioners could directly grab onto and go offer our clients better answers to their technical questions. On that front, I was a little disappointed. And the reason for that is the way academic research appears to work, and I'm not an academic, so keep that in mind, is that there's an incrementalism to it, where they're building on the previous year's academic research. The students from one year to the next take their professor's guidance and are incrementally building on the knowledge base. So brand new ideas that drop out of the sky with a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. Those don't tend to show up as much, and I did not find that. And then on top of it, there was a lot of focus on moving vehicles, whether those were electric vehicles, passenger vehicles, freight vehicles. A lot of focus on we need to move the vehicles, and that's why I said earlier. I think that we're kind of at a bit of a tipping point with regards to cities, urban areas, and how much of the focus is going to continue to be on moving vehicles versus trying to do more infill housing, promoting the active transportation, making transit more effective or at least more relevant than it has been. That was kind of missing. And in fact, there was one session, Oxford-style debate on is automobile congestion still a useful transportation metric for basically evaluating the performance of the network. And that debate, I think we've had for many decades, and I thought was asked and answered. In fact, we did a planning advisory service memo for APA back in like 2015, 2016 on that whole subject. And it seemed like even some of the debate points that we've raised in the past weren't even recognized in this debate. It was very myopically focused, kind of this challenge between pedestrians and bicyclists and urban infill versus driving around with autos and limited delay areas. The conversation is much broader than that, but we got kind of myopically focused on just those few issues.
How much do you think that's because of they're still trying to sell that to state DOTs and others who are still not getting. I mean, we'll get into this probably later into our discussion when we talk about the highway expansion stuff. But I'm wondering how much of that is just trying to continue to make folks outside of the cutting edge understand that this is something you need to think a bit forward on.
Yeah, there is still this competition of interest amongst the stakeholders, and I know our state DOTs kind of get labeled with the autocentric focus, and that's probably not always very very fair to them. And then you've got cities that are trying to do more with the active transportation or transit. In reality, I think what happens is, the constituents, the voters, still have over 80% of trips being made in cars. There's still a lot of people moving around cars, and they don't like to be delayed unnecessarily. Some delays are probably a little more tolerable than others. So as long as that exists, and we're not doing much to educate and to communicate why some of the externalities of all that driving are negative to our communities, to individuals, whether you want to look through public health or you want to look through the environmental lens. I think back to like high school. I didn't have a class that taught me about all the externalities of driving. Would have maybe added a little bit to my driving class if I could have about some of those things. So yeah, there's still the need for a better understanding, because if we're going to convince elected officials to do something different, it's really not about them. It's really about changing their constituents' minds about things could be different or better if we're framing things correctly and communicating in a way that's effective. If we don't do that as planners and engineers, can't really rely on political will to do that. That's just too big a risk based on the elected officials that I know and work with.
So you were about to say something also before I interrupted you, unfortunately. I ask you that question, but what else was going on at TRB? I mean, I'm actually interested, because the buzz online at least was about Jennifer Homendy talking about the weight of electric vehicles. I don't think that necessarily she went far enough in the discussion, but I think it's a discussion that more people are actually starting to have, which is interesting.
Well, yeah, let's talk about vehicles and operation safety and efficiency. Put all those things together. So if you think about the U.S. system, we drive really large vehicles. The average vehicle in the U.S. today is 4,000 pounds. Electrify it, and we're going to add a few more 100 pounds to that mass of metal. Average American's probably about 180 pounds. So when we're powering them things with gas, at $4 a gallon, it's taking us like 17 cents a mile to move the mass of metal, and probably less than a penny to move the human package. So there's a lot of inefficiency built into just the way we create our vehicles and move them around. The federal government has some role in that. The federal government could dictate vehicle sizes and say, no, you need to keep these things smaller and more fuel efficient, take up less lane space. We've done analysis of if we replace cars with smart cars, what would happen, and you get about 40% of your capacity back because the cars take up less screen time getting through the intersections. So we haven't done a lot to really regulate the vehicle size effect on traffic operations or traffic safety. You think of the kinetic energy of a heavier vehicle. If it collides with either a vehicle or a bicyclist or a pedestrian, the heavier it is, the more likely you're going to have those more severe outcomes. So I think that is a real topic. It kind of got focused on just the electric vehicle trends that are going on now, but it's always been here. And it's not that different. There's an incremental effect, obviously, but we've never tackled the federal government role in, regulating the vehicle sizes for any of those reasons, environmental, safety, or operations. The market has done more of that. And I'm not saying one's right or wrong, but to the extent you want to have that conversation, I would expand the conversation and include all the component parts.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, because the vehicles that have, even before electric vehicle discussion, vehicles have been getting bigger and heavier. And you see all these interesting, even certain car types. If you look at a BMW 3 Series over the years, you could see those pictures on Twitter and stuff like that. But it shows the difference in size of how much space they take up. Even the cars are getting bigger and keeping the same badge on them.
Yeah, look at the Honda Civic or Honda Accord and how much it's grown over the years. And this is something, technology is a big theme at TRB every year. Technology is always doing something different or better, supposedly. So I go back to the 90s when I first started going to TRB, and ITS was all the rage, and how much technology was going to improve our traffic performance, especially traffic operations. The reality is somewhat different. If you go back to the 90s and measure something like vehicle throughput, vehicles per hour per lane on the freeway, it's not much different today than it was 20, 30 years ago. In fact, some of our research suggests it's actually a little worse because those vehicle sizes got bigger. So they consume more space. And so all the investment in ITS, what did it actually produce, at least for traffic operations? The freeways still congest, during the peak periods. The throughput's very similar. The speeds are very similar. I look back and say, did we make a dent in the congestion problem or how congestion occurs? Simple answer is no, not really. We've not done much to improve that particular aspect of our daily lives. And if you ask the question, like, how would you? Well, instead of every freeway in the country breaking down during the morning and evening, what would we do differently so that the technology could preserve that capacity instead of 1,000 vehicles per hour per lane, getting it up to a little closer to 1,900? That's kind of the effective capacity. There's countries like Australia that do that with some of their systems. Here in the U.S., our managed lanes get a little closer. 1,500 to 1,700 is not an uncommon number you might see, like in California. But we're not getting the 1,900 out of the existing lanes, but we use congestion as the reason we're going to widen and add more lanes. So those lanes are going to be just as inefficient as the existing lanes. So again, this theme of inefficiency kind of abounds in a lot of aspects of our transportation network.
So you mentioned that you felt like you weren't learning a ton of new stuff, but was there anything that kind of stuck out at you as something new or something interesting, something that kind of brightened your day a little bit?
Yeah, there's still a lot of enthusiasm around trying to create, better transportation outcomes that are balancing all these multiple objectives. I think that's one of the real challenges in transportation. We're not just solving a congestion problem anymore. We've got to try and improve, the traveler experience, give them reliable travel times, minimize those negative externalities on things like greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants. At the same time, we want the system to create fewer collisions and less severe collisions. So we're trying to solve multiple objective type problems. And there's a lot of enthusiasm in the academic and professional world to do that. So that's alive and well at TRB. Some of the things that did get me a little excited, because I do spend a lot of time in the VMT world trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled without it seeming like it's a burden on projects. If you do it in the right way, hopefully you're creating amenities for the residents or workers so they have some choices when they travel. Some of the European research on things like mobility coins, basically using this concept of a coin or a wallet type system to increase the travel choices and let people understand what those choices or consequences are when you pick a particular mode. So you can see the cost monetarily, or you could see it in greenhouse gas emissions or energy consumed. Those are the kinds of things to help nudge people towards different choices. And that has a lot to do, obviously, with technology, one of the themes, but just being a little smarter with some of the transportation economics folded in, behavioral research as well. So that was fun to learn, to see how much progress they've made in some other countries. And we're doing some of that work here in the U.S., especially here in California as part of VMT mitigation banks and exchanges. So it's coming, hopefully soon, to a theater near you, or at least a city near you. But that was something that kind of stood out for me.
So if TRB is kind of incremental because of the way that researchers work and because of the way that knowledge is built upon itself, where are the places that you can get the kind of the new and the interesting, or the new and the cutting edge in terms of talking about access or talking about transportation from a different perspective than we usually hear?
Well, we do work with a number of clients, usually under non-disclosure agreements. So there's a fair amount of NDA work that we do where the private market is looking for ways to solve transportation problems and very creative ideas. And a lot of those, again, NDAs you can't talk about. But I can share like one concept I think is useful in the context of transit. One of the issues with transit is what was happening back in 2015, where we were already having competition for transit in terms of other modes, sharing of e-bikes and scooters and Uber and Lyft showing up, cheap credit for buying cars. So transit was being challenged at that time, and then the pandemic hit. more of a challenge. Now we add things like public health risk as a factor and whether or not people want to use transit. And then increased telework so they don't have to travel. Lots of issues there. And so how do you make transit more relevant? Well, the traditional model was you put the land use context into the formula here, and you want these fixed stations to have as much population and residents and workers packed around them, so that the likelihood of them traveling to another station that had a lot of people packed around it would be higher. Think about transit stations in the future being more dynamic, that the way we move around, the reasons we move around are probably going to vary a bit more than they have in the past. We don't have that fixed commute pattern as strongly as we have in the past. There's so many activities we can now do in our homes. So, transit stations could emerge dynamically on a daily basis. And you use the idea of these small, maybe autonomous electric vehicles assembling where they need to on a daily basis instead of these more permanent big fixed stations. That kind of concept, car sharing, if you will, but dynamically controlled and operated, maybe by transit agencies in the future, is one of those concepts. And there's been some companies that have explored that and tried to figure out how to actually deliver that. And I would not be surprised if the Ubers and Lyfts of the world are thinking about those kinds of things. But so are transit agencies to make themselves a little bit more relevant. Especially in those places where that land use context may just not be there, maybe the lower density type cities, definitely suburban locations. So I think we're going to see some of those kind of changes, and the source of whatever that new thing is very likely could be the private market versus purely an academic research or a public agency doing a study to produce that kind of outcome.
Kind of final thoughts on TRB and maybe the conferences circuit in general. I'm curious what your kind of biggest takeaway was from, seeing all the people that you see at the conference. Was there anybody you got to share some good ideas with? Any celebrities you get to see in the transportation world besides yourself, of course?
It's funny what transportation enthusiasts consider to be, a celebrity, because we might have our favorite academic. There's a lot of professors that we have a lot of respect for. So if you see one of those professors and get a chance to talk to a person that you mentioned, the poster sessions. There are professors that are there supporting their students with their, master's thesis or their doctoral research. And they're there to, talk to you and answer questions. So I ran into someone that when I first started consulting back in the very early 90s was a consultant in a partner company, Professor Robertini from Oregon State. So Rob was basically working on the same project with me. He was a consultant like I was. He wandered off into academia and has been at a few different universities, and now he's back here on the West Coast at Oregon State. And it's just great to be able to see him and to basically have him connect you with his students about their research. So it feels like kind of coming full circle that someone you worked with and shared a lot of ideas about how to improve transportation systems. And now he's in a position where he's helping to train the next generation that's going to do that. And you basically have that connection to talk to about, hey, here's some ideas we have about what you could be offering those students to make them more relevant when they come into practice and work with us.
Yeah. I always enjoy that too, seeing professors that I had, seeing, folks that I chat with through the newsletter and have talked with on the podcast, and then coming back and circling back with folks and seeing what they've been up to lately. And we had Kevin Kresik on recently talking about him and David King put out a new book. And so those discussions kind of are ongoing throughout the TRBs over the years. And I really appreciate that. So that's super fun. Well, let's get to our next section. But first, I have to do my ads for for the Overhead Wire. And thanks to everybody who has been ordering the bus and bike scarves for the holidays. We do really appreciate it. If you go to theoverheadwire.com, you can find those. They're really fun. The bus only and bike only scarves. Have you seen the scarves?
Yeah, I think you have. Do you have one hanging behind you there?
Yeah, I do. I have two of the bike only ones behind me with the checkerboards. And so it's super fun. And folks, actually, one of the most popular uses is a Zoom background rather than a scarf,
there you go.
I've been using as well.
Well, I'm going to offer you up one idea of something you should offer that we just started using. We have, you can see this in the Zoom.
The VMT Happy Hour?
VMT Happy Hour coasters. There's actually a VMT Happy Hour we have regularly with Caltrans headquarters and ARB staff and a few others here in Sacramento every other Tuesday. We took it to the East Coast and had the TRB version of it, and we had
That's
the
awesome.
coasters made up to share with a bunch of folks. And they were so popular, I'm now mailing them out to people that didn't get to go that wanted their coaster. So I could see some overhead wire coasters in your future.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Coasters. Well, you got to get your VMT happy hour coasters first. So email Ron and ask for
Email me if you
until
need
you
to.
run out, right? Until you run
Yeah,
out.
don't we run out of this print.
Also, don't forget to order any of the books we've covered on the show through our bookshop site. We have a big archive now of every book that we've ever talked about with the authors, bookshop.org/shop/the overhead wire. And also, we've designed a new sticker most of you all know about, which is our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and shirt. You can get that at tpublic, bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol. Thanks to Richard Wazensky for designing those. Have you seen the Cars Are Cholesterol sticker too? I'm sure you have.
Oh yeah,
There,
because that image pops up on my overhead
yeah,
wire
that's right.
email.
It's in my it's advertised in the email for sure. Happy New Year, everybody. This is episode 124, the first of 2023. We're in session, and just make sure that if you are listening to the show, you find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts: iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course Apple Podcast. Thank you to everybody who is subscribing through podcatchers. So let's get to the news. These are some news items that are popular in the Overhead Wire Daily. First up, why do transportation leaders keep widening highways if it doesn't work? After widening the 405 freeway, Los Angeles transportation leaders learned the hard way that widening highways only leads to more traffic and congestion. Same with the Katy Freeway in Houston. A new 710 expansion in LA would have widened another highway in the region, but was canceled in part because of an EPA said it was violating the Clean Air Act. With so much funding coming to the states through the infrastructure bill, it's hoped that these lessons are realized and money is spent not on highway widening, but on transportation access. And this was by Eden Weingart in the New York Times. We had Megan Kimball on episode 403, I believe, to talk about highway expansion in Texas, and there's still a lot of stuff going on. But as you've seen, there's highway expansions going on in New Jersey and in Colorado and in California, even throughout the state. I'm curious what your thoughts are on why we're still seeing all these expansions and why we have to have these articles in the New York Times every, maybe 6 months or so talking about this specific topic.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics, induced VMT. So on this topic, I'm both a practitioner and a little bit of a researcher, and I've published papers through TRB on the subject, working with some of our academic and state agency partners like Susan Handy at UC Davis and Chris Ganson, who's at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and Caltrans staff that have now retired, but are probably still following this content with you. So there's a few things that I think are not ever talked about in the mainstream media and even within the academic analysis. So when we talk about why widen these freeways and what are the outcomes, so there is an induced VMT effect. So that's one issue that oftentimes does not get analyzed or disclosed in the planning or environmental work. California is a little bit unique in that we pretty much mandate that you have to do that now, thanks to Senate Bill 743. But when you look at do these freeways, solve congestion, that question is usually framed very specifically around the peak hour. So the peak hour was level service F, speeds were very slow on the freeway, and after you widen the freeway, the speeds are still very slow. And what doesn't get talked about is that the level service F, or the slow speeds, lasted for 4 hours in the morning and 5 hours in the evening. And after the widening, they were 3 hours in the morning and 3.5 hours in the evening. So if you looked at total delay, there was a reduction. Now, did that freeway project, though, if you look at it long term, 5, 10, 15 years down the road, though, create some of the same circumstances that create the need for us to drive? Distances between our origins and destinations are still very far apart. We have to rely on high-speed travel to get there. They contribute to that autocentric nature of our land use patterns. But the question of why, when you're dealing with voters that don't like to be stuck in congestion and they're given a very simple, supply side solution, hey, we add more lanes, they feel like that's reacting to their problems, and they tend to support it, whether you're doing it as a sales tax measure or it's going through a state legislature. It requires you to think very analytically about all the consequences of what's going to happen long term before you start getting into the induced VMT question. And is this the outcome you really want? And I think that's the fundamental question that's now getting asked more. So is, are we getting the transportation and land use and accessibility outcomes? And that's where the question seems to be, not exactly, or an outright no in some cases. So if you really want to solve an accessibility problem, lots of ways to do that. The infill approach, put more people in close proximity to their destinations, is a good way to go if you can find a way to build that infill housing. And that's where California has really struggled. Some other states are a little bit better on that. But if you're going to be in a situation where you're not able to build the infill housing, it's going to overflow to the edges, if you will. Then you create this demand that's got to get to those destinations for work or economic reasons or social reasons. It creates a very high demand for building more of that supportive road system. So that's the feedback loop that it tends to work against doing something different. So until we can solve accessibility problems through land use, this seems to be the next best thing that elected officials are comfortable with, given the voter sentiment.
That's really interesting. And thinking about the land use part of this specifically, we've recently seen articles, again, in the New York Times and other publications, talking about how we're running out of room for single-family homes in regions. And I think that might be changing the conversation as well, because if you're running out of space for homes that people think that they are looking for, or the cheaper homes at the edges, then it actually, if you're not going to build further out, then you're probably going to relax the pressure on some of these expansion ideas in thinking about those. I just saw today, actually, there was a discussion about widening I-45, and I don't know how familiar you are with Houston, but I-45 is basically the highway that goes through downtown Houston. There's two highways, three interstate highways actually now, that go through the downtown area, 59, 45, and I-10 that goes east-west. And so, they're talking about widening I-45 in downtown, and now they're talking about widening I-45 north of Beltway 8 and then up through Conroe, which is a part of up there. And so I think, part of that has come from all the expansion in Conroe and the Woodlands and all those areas that when I was young used to be forests, and now they're housing developments. And so the pressure comes from building all those houses and getting that land use wrong on the outside, and then you start to see, like you said, the feedback loop through TxDOT of, well, we need to get people to where they need to go. How do we do that? Well, let's expand the freeway.
Yeah, and I think we also have to look at the planning and engineering profession to say, like, okay, what level of responsibility do we have for some of this feedback loop and the consequences? And one of the things I've noticed is that we use metrics like level of service or automobile speeds to basically define our freeway problem. So we say basically the cars are moving too slow. we need to make them move faster. And so the obvious solution is, make the road wider or bigger or add a new facility. But that's treating the symptom of congestion. And I think that's really important, because if you treat the symptom, you're probably not going to get the outcome that you want. And so slow speeds in the cars are caused by the fact that we have really poor seat utilization in our cars, which is caused by mispricing travel. So some of the studies we've done, and you can take a look at our seat utilization blog post series, we actually went out and measured, like, well, how many of the seats are actually occupied, peak hour, peak direction. And so we've done that in places like Utah and California and Florida. And what we find pretty consistently in the peak hour, peak direction, like from going into Sacramento, downtown Sacramento, we've not found too many locations that ever exceed more than 30% of the seats full, peak hour, peak direction. So in the case of Sacramento on Interstate 80, that was 40,000 empty seats in the peak hour and over 1 million empty seats a day. So I wouldn't say we have a congestion problem. I would say we have a seat utilization problem caused by mispricing travel and people's tendency not to want to share those seats. Can we overcome that tendency to not want to share? Maybe through pricing, maybe through behavioral economics and nudging people. We did a survey, in fact, of 5,000 of those I-80 users to find out, hey, why aren't you sharing? Some of them never wanted to share. They basically prefer their privacy and their freedom to travel, and they're just not subject to wanting to share. Others, we found it was a technological issue or an informational issue. They didn't know how. They didn't know through what means. So didn't know about things like carpool apps and those types of options. So in some respects, maybe we as the profession first need to define the problem at its root cause, and then open up the full set of solutions that can affect the outcome, such as the demand management through pricing or other means, versus just adding another inefficient lane to the existing lanes that are out there.
I've thought about this in Austin a lot. There's a toll road that goes around the center of the city, and there SH 130, and then there's I-35 that goes through downtown. They're talking about expanding I-35 in Austin. And I often wondered if what it would happen if they switched the designations on those and they turned I-35 into a toll road and made SH 130 free. And there's not a lot of through traffic. I mean, there's a fair amount of truck traffic and stuff that goes through Austin on, from San Antonio all the way up to Dallas. But that's an interesting point about pricing and thinking about, seat utilization and how much people have space in their vehicles. And is that a vehicle size thing? Is it is it a technology thing about people's ends and beginning destinations and where they get to? I'm curious what COVID discussion does to that. I know here in San Francisco in the Bay Area, the casual carpool has kind of slowed down. I think in part because people are a little bit afraid to get into vehicles with other people at the moment. But it's interesting to think about all of those different kind of factors that go into that. And we did talk about seat utilization last time you were on the show, which is a really interesting concept as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also something to this whole notion of sharing. This is a kind of an efficiency issue, and therefore, are there different ways through economic lenses we could come up with a different set of solutions to these traditional kind of congestion or transportation problems. Well, the first step in the process is making sure you're asking the complete set of questions that get you to that root cause, so you can explore a wider set of options. And there are companies and agencies out there that are starting to do that. A company like Metropia is one that has an app that can help basically offer up incentives to users to change their travel behavior, so they can actually see the cost. Like in that mobility coin example I gave you, you're looking at the cost in terms of dollars or maybe emissions, depending on what you value. So hopefully we'll get a little bit smarter at that part of the equation. But this does get to the point of where do the state governments come into play? And you mentioned ARB earlier, and things like the new scoping plan that suggest we need a 30% reduction in VMT per capita between 2019 and I believe it's 2045 if we're going to hit our greenhouse gas reduction goals. And that's from everybody. That's people that are here today, and not just new development. A lot of pressure here in California gets put on new development. Think about that. Take about 30% of your daily travel by vehicle out of the mix. How would you do that? And can you do it in a way that isn't penalty based? So one of the things that the state of California and many of the regions haven't done yet, they haven't really increased the cost of using vehicles or made them less convenient. You think of the two big levers that they could push on. Those are penalties. You're making the travelers financially worse off to lower their VMT. The state and the regions really haven't done that yet. They've tried a lot of the other things, but those other things, unless you're doing them in really big numbers, like build lots of infill housing so everyone is much closer to their destinations, that's one that might get you to 30%, but it's also one of the hardest things to do in the state. It may politically be easier in the future for them just to penalize us financially so that we consume less vehicle travel. Haven't gone there yet, but that is where the state or regions could be leaning if they're really going to hit those greenhouse gas reduction goals.
Now I'm sitting here at my house, as I have since 2014, even before the pandemic. I work from home, and I make one trip to the grocery store a week. I guess I don't count towards that 30%, right? Like I'm already, I can't lower my trips 30% really, because they don't happen. I don't have a commute, and I don't go anywhere at the moment necessarily. But it's an interesting conundrum. There's so many people probably like me who there's no real route for reducing. I mean, I guess it's home efficiency stuff rather than travel. Yeah,
I think it would come down to what are the things doing at home where you are generating trips without you being in the vehicles. Amazon. So if you think about what we do as practitioners in transportation impact studies and those kinds of things, I think one of the challenge for us to kind of catch up to where things are, we have things like the ITE trip generation manual. And they tend to measure, trips out of our driveway for our homes, for example. And it used to be that those were just the passenger vehicles that, came to and from the home. But if you think now of all the different deliveries that might be involved, whether they're Amazon packages, food deliveries, we can generate a lot of vehicle trips without being in the vehicle anymore, whether that's the Uber coming to get us with no passengers, whether that's that Amazon delivery, a food delivery. you name it, or a pet wash, pet grooming. There's a lot of different trips that we can generate, and we don't have information on that. We don't know how many trips we generate in vehicles where we're not actually present in the vehicle. But that's probably a bigger percentage in the future and growing as more service offerings occur and we choose to engage in those activities. Especially if there's something that happens in the future that there's a penalty associated with us personally traveling, like much higher gas taxes or VMT taxes. We'll probably find a way to substitute, and hopefully someone else will bear that cost.
That's also interesting too, because I know that I've tried to make sure that if I do order something from Amazon, it comes together with a bunch of other stuff, but then it comes separately from different vehicles, and you try to combine your trips from outside, and they actually, because of the just-in-time delivery system that they've created, or the next day delivery system that they've created, they actually make things worse almost on themselves, or on us even, for trips, which is kind of crazy too.
Yeah, this all comes down to this blend of a public and private transportation system, and humans being involved. Humans aren't perfect. Our systems aren't perfect. So despite some of our best efforts, the complexity of the system will tend to break down, and we won't always get the outcomes we want. There's even in some other countries like the UK, I think they tried a program called Clipper. It may still be in effect today, that where trucks going in and out of London, they coordinated filling them up. So you didn't have a bunch of half-empty trucks going in and out, and therefore more truck trips. Doing more of that, but trying to do that in the U.S. is probably a bit of a challenge. Again, public-private combinations, public road systems, but private trucking companies, and do they want to actually share their information about how full or empty they are? That's a whole other set of questions.
All right, let's go to the next story. Commute distance never changes. MIT's Sensible City Lab has created commute maps of several Chinese cities using cell phone data from 50 million people in 234 different cities. What they found was that the average commute times and distances everywhere are essentially locked at 30 minutes and 5 miles, despite the huge differences in city sizes and urbanized areas. Another interesting finding was that the central employment centers are only attractive to workers until commutes get too long. This was by Neil Patrick Walsh in Archinect. Titled The Potato Project, the study, like I said, used mobile phone location data from 50 million individuals to understand commuting patterns between a person's home and work. And this is basically a rehash, it seems like, of Marchetti's constant, something that we've known for, in transportation for a really long time about commutes and things like that. But I just found it interesting that they took so much data, cell phone data, and you work with streetlight data and thinking about VMT. We had Laura on the show a number of episodes ago. There's all this data now that you can use to calculate these things. And so doing it in another country outside of the United States where they might have different travel patterns and things like that is interesting as well.
Yeah, I think the thing that caught my attention was that distances were so similar. We don't quite see that pattern in the U.S. If you look at the variation in travel times and distances, whether you're looking at it for commute purposes or non-commute purposes, through census data, you can look at some of the commute patterns through sources like Streetlight or Replica or some of the other vendors. You can get down into the distances and those kinds of things. So we tend to see in our work that the congestion and the speeds on the network, especially as you get into more larger urban areas or big cities, the speeds really do come down. So you can't go as far in the same amount of time. So a Houston is very different than a San Francisco in that respect. So the time budgets are real, but the distances you can go in those time budgets, I think varies a little bit more here in the U.S. than maybe in China. And maybe those cities, because so many of them are newer, maybe they did follow a little bit of a similar pattern, and that the really big cities start to break up into quadrants, if you will, in terms of where people are choosing to live and work. They're thinking about that travel time budget and realistically what they can squeeze in. So that may be a limiting factor. One other kind of fun fact related to this, a couple, this is about 2018 might have been when I was at TRB. One of the researchers that I talked to during a poster session, I think they had worked with one of the online dating apps, and they were looking at the effect of search radius on how many matches you might be able to achieve, and the effect that congestion had on the pool of candidates. So in places like Washington, D.C. or New York, if you put a 20-minute drive time or travel time as one of your filters, you could definitely be limiting the pool of candidates because of the level of congestion. It worked better in an Oklahoma City versus some of those more urbanized places.
I feel like I used to, before I met my wife, did a lot of online dating, and I feel like here in San Francisco specifically, if you were in a certain neighborhood, there is a no-go. I wasn't going to the Richmond district from the Mission. It was kind of like, oh, that's too far. It's going to take too long to get to the 38 bus, and it's not gonna work. We can meet downtown maybe, but well, how's that going to work? And eventually, my wife lived kind of on the J. So we could get on one train and then that would be good. So it actually worked out in the end. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me as somebody who previously did that. Okay, next up, the final story for today is, yes, the sounds your neighbors make are annoying you. If you ever wondered why you dislike the sound of a child doing jumping jacks on the floor above your apartment, this story is for you. Noises from neighbors elicit fight or flight responses, which is why they are so disturbing to us as humans and make us grumpy. Researchers studying these effects aim to shape design guidance on soundproofing. This was by Lena Zeldovich in Nautilus. And we were talking actually before the show a little bit about AI and what you could find if you actually used AI to find articles and things like that. And this is one of the articles I feel like an AI would not have found. I probably would have found this article before the AI found this article because it's something that was just out of the ordinary, but I felt like it had an important part of the discussion of urban life and transportation overall. Even if it's not so much transportation, it's still thinking about sound in this way. If you live close together with other people because you decided to live in a city because of the transportation situation, you're going to have these annoyances with having neighbors above you or beside you, which I think everybody who lives in a city, especially San Francisco, has had before. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, about sounds and about how they kind of raise your hackles, maybe if they're too loud or too much of something that bothers you.
Yeah, I actually really enjoyed this article for kind of three reasons. One, I've got a good buddy who's a acoustical consultant, and he's helped me understand over the years how important the acoustical design of buildings is in particular, but also the challenges of like noise ordinances. You're trying to do with infill development, you're putting more people in close proximity. You're basically creating crowded conditions, and it creates more noise. So in many California cities, we've run into that issue on certain projects where you're trying to do the things that the general plans had to do with land use, but you run afoul of like a noise impact. And so you need to reconcile that, hopefully at the general plan level, to say, no, this is an accepted impact because of all the other objectives we're trying to achieve. The other thing that this struck a chord with me was in our open office layouts that became so popular over the last decade or so. One of the first things I noticed when we went to the open office layout is how many people put on headphones. And how big a distraction the noise around them really was. And when I went around and asked the employees, why, they would explain, too distracting. And then I asked them, well, what are you listening to? And I looked into some of the research as to, when you listen to things, how does that affect your brain capacity, doing calculations, that kind of stuff. And most of them were listening to music. Some were listening to podcasts. People were, audiobooks. And what I was able to find was that, hey, anytime you're listening to something that has words in it, it's probably difficult for you to not consume a little bit of brain space with listening to those words, paying attention, and then trying to get your regular work done. If you're listening to like white noise, no, you're probably okay. But that wasn't a popular listening subject. So I think this is really important, that the acoustics of our environment are going to definitely have an effect on us, and especially, like I said in the article, the thuds and those things that are surprising, that our primordial DNA is basically warning us, hey, something might be wrong, you need to jump up. So as with anything in the built environment, and us fickle humans, we need to think through all the kinds of issues and the trade-offs involved with those issues anytime we're trying to design spaces for our use.
That's interesting about the what you listen to. When I was younger and I was doing math homework, I'd listen to music, but it was music that I already listened to the song 5 or 6 times. It was CDs that I had that are kind of used background, and actually helped me focus because it allowed me to maybe push something out of my kind of block out and focus a little bit more. I find now that I can listen to music a little bit, but I think sports broadcasting is, sports podcasts I can listen to and do my work. I can't write papers when I'm doing that, but I can do it because it doesn't matter what they're talking about. I can always block it out because it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter. It's not like a true crime podcast where you have to get every word. They're talking about something sports related. They're like, oh, well, so-and-so scored and this person won or whatever. It doesn't matter because if I miss it, they'll probably talk about it again later or whatever. But if it's like a serious podcast where you have to like listen to all the words to get everything that comes together, I can't do that. So it's interesting to see how that actually impacts people's brains when they're trying to work. I don't necessarily do it as much now because I find that I really do want to focus a little bit more than I maybe, not that I didn't want to focus before, but I find that it's just faster and I can get my work done quicker if I actually go through it. But I don't know, did you have headphones, or do you have an office, actually I should say, in the open concept? Did you have an office, or is it something where you
all of the above, and then I work in cubes as well. So I have developed some techniques. So what I do on my calendar, you'll see DW stands for deep work. If I'm in a deep work mode, I'm going in some place where I can shut the door and I can block out any and all distractions, not just the noise, visual distractions as well. So I'm probably in some kind of cave equivalent. One of my favorite coffee shops literally has a cave section. But then if I am doing, I don't want to call it shallow work, but probably involves email, something to that effect. Yeah, I can probably listen to something that starts to feel like white noise. Sounds like for you, sports is almost white noise.
Yeah, it's a white noise. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I like nature sounds. I'm an outdoorsman, do a lot of fishing and that kind of stuff. So if I just needed some sound because it's too quiet, sometimes I'm in an office where it feels like it's too quiet. Like little nature sounds in the background, that kind of thing. And then if I really don't need to use my brain, I'm just kind of glancing at some things I just need to review. Yeah, maybe at that point then I'll go white noise, and it might be a podcast or something like that. But that's rare during the work hours anyway.
Yeah, this week on Talking Headways, we had Michael Huisman on from the Netherlands, and he was talking about urban soundscapes, which is a really interesting topic that we had. I'm always interested in these kind of other senses when it comes to cities. Sound and feel and touch and sight is one of the things that's the main thing for most people that are able-bodied. But there's all these other ways that the city can influence how you feel and your well-being and those types of things. So we talked with him about, how do you design a soundscape, and they've worked on places like the Beursplein in Rotterdam, where they might have 40 trains an hour, trams an hour coming through, and the ding, ding, ding of the crossing, it doesn't act as a deterrent anymore because people are so like used to that going off all the time. And so it was interesting to talk with him about how they design a space that's enjoyable, but also, useful for safety and other things.
Yeah, I can't remember what city I was in where they played bird sounds along the streetscape, and they did it as a way to provide a calm walking environment as you strolled by the shops. So I think there is something to that. At least the birds anyway seem to calm us down a little bit.
Nature, yeah, the nature and the normal nature sounds, for sure. Well, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without you, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're appreciative of that. $2 a month, you get stickers and a handwritten note, and you get one of our cars or cholesterol stickers as well. $10 a month, and you get our bus-only or bike-only scarf. So check those out if you get a chance, patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, we did an audiobook, Raymond Unwin's 1909 Classic Town Planning and Practice. If you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. You can download it as a podcast. Each chapter is actually a podcast when you go to raymondunwin.com. And actually, one of those things you were talking about, deep focus, right? So when you're doing an audiobook, and I've done half of an audiobook. I'm working on it. I don't know if I'll ever finish it or not. I hope I do. You have to go into this space where you can't just do it for 5 minutes at a time. You have to do it for like 4 hours at a time. And so if you're distracted in any form or fashion in that, time when you're in that kind of that mode or that mood, it really messes everything up, because you're trying to make the chapter sound the same, right? You want it to sound exactly the same as the beginning of the chapter as the end of the chapter. So you can't kind of come in and out of it. You have to do it all at once. And so you kind of have to get in that deep space. And it's hard to do because finding a 2 hour to 4 hour block of time is not easy these days. as you know.
Yeah, I tend to make mine about 2 hours, no more than four, because I find that mentally I'm kind of exhausted if I was able to go the full 4 hours. And
Yeah.
the book, by Cal Newport on deep work talks about that. Yes, you want that space and that time where you can just focus, but because you're focusing so hard, it definitely consumes your mental energy at a much higher rate.
Yeah, you do get tired. And also, listener questions and comments, feel free to ask any questions of us. Feel free to email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com, and we'll post those and talk about them on the podcast on the Monday show when we get there. So finally, Puppies and Butterflies is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections. Ron, do you have something that's made you happy lately in the transportation or urban planning space, or even just life in general?
Well, I'm going to come back to VMT Happy Hour and the East Coast version. We were able to share that with this just unique mix of people that, from academia, even elected officials have popped in, and you got the practitioners. And it's a place where you get to share ideas and you get to question things. And I think one of the challenges today in any practice is the ability to question things without upsetting people. So to have a forum where everyone's comfortable bringing their ideas, their questions, and you collaborate and you kind of pick them apart and try and understand each other. It's just a really fun space. So I appreciate the fact that we were able to do that on the East Coast. And for any of you that want to join us on a Tuesday night in Sacramento, SAC Yards is where we host those. We welcome all VMT reduction enthusiasts, I should say. We're not trying to necessarily generate any more VMT.
That'd be interesting if the VMT incremental increasing people came. I don't know what you'd call them. Maybe it's just highway expanders. I don't know. But it'd be interesting if you got almost like it would be maybe West Side Story, get some trouble in there talking about VMT. I can't see where that would go, but it might be interesting. So I'm not on TikTok, but sometimes videos from that service make the news. And on this specific instance, there was a video of a dog bus in Alaska. And so this person's driving around and picking up all the dogs and going on play dates and stuff. And so the dogs getting on the bus was entertaining to me. They're waiting outside their houses it's almost like kids getting picked up for school. And so they get on the bus and they have harnesses on the bus for the dogs, and it's just kind of fun. I've heard many stories of like dogs that kind of commandeer bus routes to get to where they want to go in the city. They might have a favorite park that they go to, and so the bus driver knows that this dog is going to get on and then get off 3 stops later. I don't know. For some reason, nature is funny that way.
Yeah, two observations there. One, I saw the video, and I was curious as to, well, people would let the dog wait by themselves for the bus, but didn't trust letting their kid wait by themselves. Maybe as parents, we're a little more I don't know, risk adverse in that respect. But I did have a Uber trip one time going from a lecture at UCLA to downtown. And this was back when Uber Pool was first being tried out. And so we stopped along the way, and a lady put her dog in the Uber with me, clipped it to the seat belt, and she did not get in the Uber. She shut the door, and the driver was trying to explain to her that he can't just take a dog. And she was insistent that the dog had an appointment at the dog park with his buddy, and she could not miss that appointment. And she tipped the driver extra to take the dog. So we took the dog to the dog park and found his friend. And the dog seemed quite happy to have taken the ride and got out at the dog park where the lady was waiting for her. So yeah, catering to our dogs and our pets seems to be something that we enjoy doing.
That's so funny. If you want to watch this TikTok, at mo_mountain_mutts, Mo Mountain Mutts. Ron, where can folks find you online if you wish to be found?
If I wish to be found, that's a great question, because when I first started at Fehr and Peers, Jack Pierce, one of the founders, told me that one of the things that he was trying to do in starting the company is he wanted an unlisted number. And I was like, why would you want an unlisted number? Because he only wanted to give it to clients he wanted to work with. He was, older in his career and had been through good clients, bad clients. I thought, wow, that's a great idea, just to be able to give it out to clients you want. I don't have that luxury. I think I still need to grow my clients. So I do have a LinkedIn space, but that's about it online. Otherwise, it's just contacting me at Fehr and Peers and r.milam@fehrandpeers.com. and I'd be happy to respond to any questions regarding the podcast content.
Awesome. You can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at theoverheadwire.com. You can also find me on Mastodon now, The Overhead Wire at sfba.social. I might have more to say about Twitter in the future, depending on how much in flames it turns into. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thank you, Ron, for coming on the show. We really appreciate you joining us on this Monday, and we'll see everybody next time.
Talking Monday.